Check, check. Hello, hello folks. Hello. Welcome to the Athena Cinema, Southeastern Ohio's premier art house theater. You're here, congratulations. Nice, beautiful audience. This is awesome. My name's Yang Miller. I'm the technical director and audience experience coordinator here at the theater. So if any of you need your experience coordinated, at any point during the show, just come tap me. I'll do what I can to take care of you. Tonight is the National Evening of Science on Screen, so there's theaters all across the country that are doing science on screen presentations, which pair a film with a talk on science, so it's pretty cool. Here at the Athena, we give you a little extra. There's free pizza afterwards, so stick around. And it's from Avalanche, so why not? It's from Avalanche.
Yeah, we need to get it.
I just wanted to let everybody know, next week is the film festival here at the Athena. The 44th Annual Athens International Film and Video Festival. We've got these booklets in the lobby, grab one. There's lots of free events for students, free for the public, lots of great stuff coming up there. We'd like to thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Coolidge Corner Theater, and Arts for Ohio for making this possible. And our next show will be on April 17th, and we'll have Dean Dennis Irwin from the Russ College of Engineering, and he'll be presenting Apollo 13. But in the meantime, please help me welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Kimberly Rios.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to be here and to share my love of horror with all of you tonight. And just to give a preface for what I mean by that, I wanted to show you a couple of Halloweens from my life. On the left here is Halloween from 1987. I was in kindergarten, and I'm obviously really liking my Bride of Frankenstein, otherwise known as my sister, attacking me as a little genie. And about 30 years later, fast forward to when I was the final girl for Nightmare on Elm Street, and I'm enjoying being attacked by my little Freddy Krueger dog. So my love of horror goes way back, and this is one of many reasons I was so excited to come here and present a little bit of the psychological mechanisms behind The Shining. And so just to give an overview of what I'm going to discuss, first I'll, as these pictures imply, talk about why people are drawn to horror in the first place. And then I'll segue into the related question of what we experience psychologically when we see horror movies. And finally, open it up more broadly to, as you're watching The Shining, I encourage you to think of what the characters are experiencing, especially in the way of feelings of threat and uncertainty, which is what a lot of my research focuses on. So in terms of just answering the question of what makes horror and related genres appeal to people in the first place, there is a host of research from the social sciences about this. And some of the most basic research focuses on the individual difference and demographic factors behind this. First of all, the personality trait of sensation seeking. So sensation seeking, if you're thinking about whether you fit this profile, people who are sensation seekers are people who are drawn to novel, stimulating, exciting experiences. So these are the people who would report enjoying doing things like skydiving, trying really exotic spicy foods, going on really adventurous trips, and yes, watching horror movies. That definitely is related. With respect to age and gender, age, people who are younger typically tend to like horror more than older folks, but as I see here, the demographic audience is quite diverse. I would assume that depends on the particular type of movie. With the teen slashers that are coming out nowadays, yes, that would probably draw a younger audience overall. And with regard to gender, again, it's a mixed bag. Whereas some of the research has found that men are generally more drawn to horror than women are, there is some other more recent research suggesting that women are actually drawn to things like true crime. So something like The Shining would be a bit of both here. It's a horror fiction movie, but it has elements of some of the characteristics you might see in true crime films, so could possibly appeal to both. And indeed, I look out here and I see a male to female ratio about 50-50. So in terms of what is it about horror in particular that draws people to it, there are some obvious answers, like some people say, I like the jump scares, I like the blood and guts, I like the general sense of destruction and power that that often is implicated in these horror movies. But there are some people like myself who really like horror but aren't too big of fans of the blood and guts. And perhaps some of those people are drawn to horror because they feel like there's a meaningful and satisfying resolution at the end, even if you don't know necessarily what's going to happen as you're watching the movie. In general, although there are some exceptions to this rule, the good guy usually wins. And indeed, a lot of studies have found that people tend to prefer horror movies with happy endings where the protagonist wins out, relative to those where the bad guy wins or the ending is just too ambiguous to really tell. Now, going into these next two bullet points here, in terms of more psychological factors, some of the research on true crime and why people are drawn to that suggests that if there are psychological motives of the bad guy or the antagonist that are presented, then that'll draw people more to learning about those stories. And also, for women especially, if there's a true crime story that is accompanied by some sort of story about a survival technique that she used to get away from her captor. So, for example, somebody who's running away in handcuffs uses the pin that she pulled from her watch to unlock the handcuffs and gets away that way, then people are more likely to want to read that story than if no survival technique is presented. So, to get into the major theme of what I'm going to discuss here, aside from these individual differences and these genre-specific factors, I want to probe more deeply what is the psychological mechanism and what do we experience when we think of and when we consume horror. And what I want to argue, based on my own research and the research of others in my field, which is social psychology, is that horror allows us to experience a sense of uncertainty and the unknown without these fears and these threatening feelings that would often be accompanied with these if we actually were in a situation where something could happen to us. So we're watching these horror movies in a safe space. We're watching most likely with friends, and we know that this isn't about us, and it's not something that could happen to us. I do have a student this morning who said, well, when you're in a horror movie, you never know who's behind you or what's behind you, and yeah, then I guess that would be uncertain, accompanied by feelings of threat. But by and large, when we watch, we know this isn't going to happen to us. And we can assume, based on most of the endings that provide satisfying resolution, where the good guy usually wins, we know, even though we don't know what's going to happen to these characters that we care about in the course of the movie, we know that it's going to be resolved by the end. But I'm going to point out a caveat here, which is if we try to relate too much to what the characters are experiencing in horror movies, if we put ourselves too much in their shoes, then that could lead us to experience some of these same feelings of threat. There's a phenomenon called emotional contagion that's prevalent in my field, whereby people tend to become and experience the emotions of the characters that they're watching. So be careful if you're watching a horror movie and you're relating too much to this character who's being chased by the bad guy. You don't want to feel as much threat as he or she probably does. But that said, a lot of uncertainty can be neutral, or in the case of people who like horror movies, even positive. So we can read about events in the world that are happening that are completely irrelevant to us or to any situations we're experiencing and think, well, I feel uncertain, I don't know how this is going to be resolved, but I know this does not affect me. This isn't the sense of psychological threat that I experience. And other forms of uncertainty are downright positive. So, for example, if I really like horror movies and I want to experience the uncertainty without the threat, yes, bring it on. And similarly, when we open gifts for holidays, we see magic tricks, we don't necessarily know how the trick is done, but we're enjoying it anyway. we have as a dorky parent of, well, 1.5 dogs, you have a DNA test that you've sent in and you want to see what your dog is, and you're so excited to open those results. Those are all positive forms of uncertainty. So in terms of forms of uncertainty that are negative and perhaps threatening, I'm going to break these down into 4 categories based on my field and some of the research that I've done. Now, the first form of uncertainty that poses a threat to people is what we think of as a very obvious one, mortality. So we all know, sorry to break it to you guys, we all know we're going to die. Hopefully we know that, but we don't know. We don't know when, how, exactly what's going to happen in the afterlife, what's going to happen once we physically die and are physically dead. Sorry guys, no, this is kind of a bummer. So I'll segue on to a threat to a general sense of meaning. And so that's a second kind of threat that people can experience that has to do with what's the purpose of life in general? Does my world really make sense right now? And one of the best examples of the latter that I can think of is when you go to another country and you experience culture shock. There's different customs. People are maybe driving on the wrong side of the road like they do in Australia, and you're just not really sure what's going on and how you fit into this world. Now, getting to the more personal kinds of threats, we can experience threats to our self-concept with us not knowing who we are, what we really value. If you're a student, you may not know whether you'll get that job you want after you graduate or what you want to major in. And if you're out in the working world already, you may have questions about whether you prioritize one aspect or another of your life versus your career. All these kinds of things can fall into the category of threats to the self-concept and uncertainty about that. And finally, as social creatures, we humans all experience from time to time threats to belonging and sense of social connectedness with others. We wonder whether we fit in with our peer groups, whether other people like or accept us, and in the romantic relationship realm, are we ever going to find the one? If we think we have, is that really going to last? Those are all potential sources of threatening uncertainty. Now, in terms of how we as human beings psychologically respond to these feelings of threat and uncertainty, there's a lot of research that has been done to show these different kinds of responses. For example, when we experience threats to our sense of mortality, we're reminded of the fact that we're going to die, or we're just experiencing general threats to our self-esteem, then we shore up our attitudes and our personal values, and we become much more certain and much more extreme in these convictions that we already had in the first place. And we're also more likely, under these conditions of threat, to affiliate with really radical or extreme groups. So if you think about, for example, why people join cults, why 900 people moved down to Jonestown in the 1970s and all passed away except for a very few. You can think of a lot of these threats people were experiencing, most likely threat to their sense of connectedness with others, not really knowing what their future held, and this made them adhere to what was seen as a really strong leader and a strong sense of community. My dissertation research, when I was completing my PhD about 1 million years ago, showed that when we're feeling uncertain about our self-concept and who we are, we're most likely to voice really unpopular opinions and deviant opinions in order to convey to ourselves and others, this is who I am and this is what I stand for. Now, of course, this may or may not be a good thing, but leave that open to interpretation. And also, when we're experiencing threats to our sense of belonging and connectedness with others, so if we're put in a room and we're told everybody in the room has to pair up with each other. Now think of being in PE class as a kid, like in junior high, right? And you're all nervous about whether somebody's going to pick you for their team. Well, imagine being told by the researcher, no one picked you, nobody wants to work with you. In those sorts of situations, relative to, oh, you were just the odd number who was left alone by chance, it wasn't because of what anybody decided, then people who are in that situation, who are told nobody wants to work with you, are less likely to cooperate with others, less likely to help other people, in general just behave more antagonistically and lash out because they're feeling this threat to their sense of connection. But I should note here that when we experience uncertainty without this foreboding sense of threat, we do tend to react a bit more positively. A lot of these aversive reactions that I put up here are eliminated or even at best reversed. So that is something to keep in mind with respect to the virtues of uncertainty relative to uncertainty coupled with threat. So in terms of what kinds of threat the characters in The Shining might have experienced, and I'd like you to continue thinking about this as you watch the movie. One of the most obvious, that almost goes without saying, is mortality, or good old red rum. So beyond the obvious though, some of the characters in The Shining may have experienced a threat to their sense of meaning in life. So without spoiling too much of the movie before you see it, if you haven't already, there are a fair number of ghosts that appear, surprise, and you may, people in the movie, the characters in the movie, may not know whether these ghosts are real or whether they're just products of their imagination, and you can imagine if you were in their shoes that that would be particularly threatening. And moreover, there's this scene in the movie where one of the main characters is transported back in time several decades. He doesn't know who he is anymore, when he is, where he is, all sorts of meaning threats in that situation. With respect to threats to the self-concept, I think most of these threats can come from the protagonist in the movie. If we observe what he went through, he lost his job, which is why he went to take that job in the cabin, and he experiences a fair amount of writer's block while he's there, both of which can threaten his sense of, who am I? What is my career path going forward? What do I really value? What am I really good at? And finally, with respect to threats to belonging and social connectedness, one of the main phenomena that gets talked about, indeed, one of the things that drew the staff here to pick The Shining as the movie tonight was this phenomenon of cabin fever. The idea that you're in an isolated place with hardly anybody around that you know, and because, again, we're social creatures, this can be somewhat, and indeed extremely threatening to a lot of people. And just even going deeper than that, within The Shining, there's a family unit of three, a mom, a dad, and a little boy, that once things start happening within that family unit to break it down and to cause it to be compromised, likely all three of these members are thinking, is my relationship with each of these other two members of the family what I thought that it was? What's going to happen here? What's our future going to be like? So as you sit back and watch the film, I'd like to invite you to consider some of these questions that I've raised today. First of all, why are you here? Why do horror movies and related genres appeal to you? Perhaps you fit one of the characteristics, one of the psychological motives that I talked about earlier. Perhaps you're just here with your friends who dragged you here and you don't really like scary movies. And if that's the case, I want to leave you with a couple thoughts, which is number one, you're here with friends, you're probably watching this in a safe space. You're feeling connected with others, it's a bonding experience. And likely nothing is going to happen to you in this movie theater. I can't quite say the same for the characters whose fates we're going to see unfold during the actual movie. And so I'd encourage you to reframe this sense of uncertainty that you might be feeling as you watch, well, what's going to happen to these characters, what's going to happen in the plot. If you're nervous about that, frame it to be more positive as something that maybe is totally irrelevant to yourself. This is not going to happen to me in any way, shape, or form. I can distance myself from this, and perhaps it's even a challenge. All right, let's see what I'm made of because I'm watching this really, really scary movie. Now, I'd also like you to consider what other threats, aside from what I've mentioned, the characters in The Shining are experiencing. I detailed many of them from both my own and other people's research, but I want you to think about this as well. How do these characters respond to the threats, and would you experience the same level of threat if you were in this situation? How would you respond to it? But again, I want to caution you against relating too much to the experiences of the characters in this movie. Because on the one hand, you could end up like the wife here on the right, being afraid for your life. You don't want to empathize too much with her. Don't want to be too scared about your husband coming after you. And I think it goes without saying that nobody in this room wants to become the guy on the left, even though we may very much be entertained by him. So with that, I would like to thank you very much. Please enjoy the film. I know I certainly will. And I'm available for questions after the movie. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. The film will start in about 5 minutes. We just need to do a couple of technical things, and then we'll get started. Thanks so much.